Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Elizabeth and I work in the archives at the Ann Arbor District Library. And I'm so excited to introduce you to Libby Copeland. She is an award-winning journalist who has contributed to top publications such as The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Slate, The New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, and many more. And today I'm pleased to have the opportunity to discuss her recently published book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. And in your book, you discuss the rapidly changing landscape of genetic genealogy and explore some fascinating stories along the way of lives changed by DNA testing. And I really enjoyed reading the book, not only as someone who is peripherally interested in genealogy, but I work in the archives and I have an interest in history as well. So I just want to get started and ask the simple question: how did you come to write The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are?
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's a thrill to be here and to meet you. So I came to write the book 3 years ago, was when the genesis of the book came to be. I wrote an article for the Washington Post. And the article looked at this idea that this technology, which is billed as recreational, as entertainment, DNA testing for understanding your ancestry, for getting a taste of your family history, for getting one of those little ethnicity estimate pie charts that tell you how Swedish or Nigerian you are, that this technology, which was very low cost, $99 or less, and that people were buying during sales, were gifting to each other during holidays, was often sort of something far more profound than they were expecting, right? That it was causing them to understand the past in a really new way. And in some cases, reconfiguring their understanding of their own immediate family members and of their own genetic origins, and causing them to go on quests where they were reaching out to newfound fathers, newfound siblings, rethinking basically how they came into the world. So I wrote this article for the Washington Post. It was July of 2017. And what happened in the aftermath was what kind of blew me away. I started getting emails from hundreds of readers all across the country and all across the world who had read this and basically wanted to say, that was an amazing story. And now let me tell you another one. I want to tell you about what happened to me. And what I started hearing was, a vast array of tales of sort of the redefinition of people's identities. These were people who perhaps were learning that they were not genetically related to their fathers. That was one of the most common types of DNA surprise. It's so common that it's known in this world by an acronym that is so popular that everyone in this world kind of knows it. And that is that you are the product of an NPE, or non-paternity event, or not parent expected. So a lot of people were discovering this and then were finding, oh wow, then they had actually some stranger out in the world who had contributed half their genetic material, and siblings perhaps from that child, from that father. And then, of course, it has implications for your immediate family, the one that you grew up with, and all sorts of questions about what was said and what was not said. And now you're assumed to be full siblings or half siblings. So it has kind of ripple effects that can carry through multiple families. I heard from people who were discovering that they were donor conceived and never told, or that they knew they were donor conceived, but they were discovering that they had 10, 20, 50, sometimes upwards of 100 half siblings through the same donor father, which, is a state of affairs that really causes you to think about, how do we define family? How do you forge relationships with those people? I heard from a number of adoptees. Many adopted persons have been using DNA testing for a decade now to find their way around the lack of access to their original birth certificate, so they can find the identities of their birth parents. And I heard from people who did not know that they were adopted, and they had found out this way. And I also found, whole other, categories of stories, including people whose genetic ancestries were hidden from them for reasons of assimilation or escape from discrimination, and just, every sort of category that you can imagine. And the stories came in and they were intensely personal, intensely intimate, often deeply emotional, and people talked about being received warmly by their genetic families, being rejected by their genetic families, going on sort of journeys of selfhood. And I was just struck by the profundity of this. This is not a phenomenon that is hitting one demographic or one generation. This is sort of a transformation across American culture, one individual and one family at a time. And I just thought, my goodness, this has got to be a book.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many stories throughout the book that were extremely interesting, and mysteries also.
Yes.
And one of those was the story of Alice Collins Plebuc. Is that how you say
Yeah,
her
it's
last name?
pronounced Playbuke.
Plebuc.
Yeah.
Okay. And she has a lot of twists and turns throughout her story. I won't spoil the ending, but it is a really captivating ending, what happened, and what you were able, or what she was able to find out and what you reported on. So I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about her quest
Yeah.
and how she got there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Alice Collins Playbuke is at the beginning when we first meet her in 2012, she is a retired person who is very much a technology maven. She has worked her entire career, starting with mainframe computers back in the 60s, with the flow of vast swaths of information. So she's somebody who is uniquely situated to kind of understand big data. And this is a key component of her background, and because it comes into play when she embarks on her own search for self. So it's 2012. She is living on the West Coast in Washington State. She is very interested in genealogy. She's been doing family history research for years. And she, like many people who get a DNA surprise, goes into it without, necessarily expectations about anything being upended, right? She kind of knows what she's going to find, which is how most of us feel when we go into it. Even those of us who get a surprise don't go in assuming that's going to happen. We assume we know everything there is to know. And she knows herself to be Irish American. She's Irish on both sides of the family, with a smattering of English and Scottish, but mostly Irish, both sides. She comes from a large Irish Catholic family. There's 7 Collins siblings. And she's just looking to kind of augment that research, like so many genealogists. And Ancestry, which would become the big elephant in the room in terms of database size, at that moment was just unveiling its DNA test. So this is the dawn of, it's not the beginning of DNA testing for ancestry purposes, but it's the dawn of autosomal DNA testing. And autosomal DNA testing is the kind of DNA testing that everyone who is mostly familiar with. It's the test that gives you that ethnicity estimate pie chart, and also gives you lists of genetic relatives in the same database along your maternal and paternal sides. So Ancestry's test is still in beta. They're kind of just testing it out. And she gets on a list and she spits into a vial and she gets her results back. And instead of being entirely Irish and British Isles, her pie chart is split down the middle. And half of it is Ashkenazi Jewish, which is genetic ancestry from Eastern and Central Europe, Jewish ancestry. And she's flummoxed and at first just assumes that Ancestry's test is not up to snuff. Like they don't know the science, they don't know what they're doing. And she even emails them and is like, yeah, you guys don't know what you're doing. But she investigates and over time comes to find out that in fact Ancestry does know what it's doing and that the flaw is in her family's knowledge of itself. So what's interesting about Alice? What's interesting is that she embarks on this kind of existential whodunit that takes her 2.5 years. And the reason it takes so long is partially that none of the expected explanations apply, right? She's not the product of an NPE, a theory that she investigates and is able to dismiss. She is not donor conceived. She is not adopted, also something she considers. And she is not coming from a people who hid their Jewish genetic ancestry. You know, they didn't convert and then there was the process of kind of intergenerational forgetting or purposeful not telling, which you do see in some families, but that wasn't the case. She goes through each theory very methodically because she's a very analytical person and she goes through theory after theory. And what I like about her narrative is because there's so many surprises and red herrings and twists and turns. It's very compelling. The surprise ending is so kind of stunning that the genetic genealogist she worked with said, you know, when I first heard this, it sounded too much like a soap opera to be true. I didn't think that that was possible, right? And it winds up taking her back 100 years. And one of the thrills of the book, because I also love history as you do, was being able to go back and research 100 years and sort of get to the origins of the beginnings of her family's mystery. What this allows me to do in the book, which is a kind of a fun structural element, is as she goes through each theory, you know, am I the product of an MPE? Am I adopted? It allows me to show you what it looks like to discover that you are not related genetically to your dad when you test, or to find out you're adopted from spitting into a vial, which was a very compelling story that I tell in the book. The other thing that's really interesting about Alice's story is I was telling you about how she has this incredible mind for data and she has this background in technology. Well, those elements of her career training would wind up coming into play in a really big way when she embarked on the project of her retirement, which became a full-time job for her for 2.5 years. And day in, day out, every day, all day, she was trying to figure out her own genetic mystery. And she did this by essentially building a massive database of her own DNA. And by that, I mean, she found all the genetic cousins for herself and all of her 6 siblings, which was numbering in the thousands. She looked at every single overlapping genetic segment that she had with these genetic cousins, which was numbering over 300,000. And she created massive spreadsheets and she tracked and reached out to as many as she could of these cousins and tried to build family trees to understand how they were related. It was a absolutely massive undertaking. She did it with her sister, but it was, you know, sort of spearheaded by Alice. And it's absolutely fascinating. And one of the thrills of getting to write this book was getting to fly out to Washington State and sit with her, because she has this extraordinary analytical brain. And I could sit there and kind of crawl around inside her brain and see how she thinks. And it was such a privilege.
Yeah, Alice's story was definitely one of my favorites. There are a lot of different stories throughout, though, that were gripping. There was one, Roberta Estes actually is from Ann Arbor.
Yes.
And she was a really interesting person, and her work was fascinating as well, especially like back in the day when there wasn't 23andMe, you couldn't just spit into a vial.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the great things about this whole world is getting to talk to genealogists who were doing this back when paper records and maybe microfilm were your options, right? And you know, you were writing letters to clerks in states far away and waiting months for their response. And you know, these people are very dedicated, and they're very okay with the slowness of the process. You know, back in the 80s and the 70s, this was not something where you could just swab your cheek and get an answer. And now, you know, it's kind of reversed. So, you know, a lot of longtime genealogists have used DNA to access information very, very quickly. But also a lot of Americans have stumbled into genealogy by way of a DNA test, because the DNA test becomes like a kind of a cheap, easy backdoor. And you suddenly see, oh, wait a minute, I have this first cousin I've never heard of, like, and then you start digging.
Yeah, exactly. Back to the DNA testing, just as like a recreational thing. It is fascinating because it often is just a Christmas gift that someone gives to the family member. But then it acts as a catalyst to reveal something profound that no one knew. Maybe one family member knew, no one knew. So
Right.
could you talk about how it acts in that way as both of those aspects?
Right. Like, how is it at once like a no big deal investment and also this kind of revelatory force, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, if you kind of look back at the history of the industry, you can see how it transformed from a niche item to a mainstream consumer item, which is what it is now. In the very beginning, the DNA testing for ancestry purposes is exactly 20 years old. The first kits were sent out by Family Tree DNA, which was the first DNA testing company for ancestry purposes in the US, back in April of 2000. And at the time, what they were selling was a Y DNA test kit. So this was looking at DNA in a man's Y chromosome. So if you were a woman and you were looking, you couldn't test yourself. You'd have to ask like your brother or your dad, and you were only looking at one specific line, which was your patrilineal line. So like the Y is inherited from one man, you know, from his father and his father's father and all the way up. And then they added mitochondrial DNA testing, which also is more looking at ancient DNA and ancient migration patterns. You're not accessing what autosomal gives you. You're not looking at immediate kin. You're not seeing like a more recent story, and you're not getting that pie chart that's telling you what most Americans are interested in, which is like, you know, where did my people come from, say 500 years ago, right? So the results in the beginning were different and, in a sense, cruder, and the tests were more expensive. And so you didn't really see a lot of people buying it. And in fact, the founder of Family Tree DNA, I was able to go down to Texas and interview him. And he said, you know, I would go to genealogy conferences and I would try to convince people that my product was relevant to them, and they were not interested. I would shake their hands and I would walk backwards, not letting go, and, you know, kind of lure them to my booth in hopes of making a sale. Like it was so difficult. And then you see autosomal coming on the scene about 10 years ago in fits and starts. It's unveiled by different companies at different times. Ancestry comes on the scene in 2012. That's kind of a big deal. By 2013, if you looked at the major companies and you added all their databases together, you had probably about 1 million customers altogether. Now, today, there are 35 million, right? And the growth just in the last few years has been extraordinary. I mean, when I wrote my first article for the Washington Post, it was the summer of 2017, there were 8 million people in the databases. 2 years later, there were 30. And if you look at the amount of money that the companies have spent on advertising these kits, it's pretty extraordinary. In 2016 and 2017, Ancestry spent $100 million on advertising each year, just each year. So 200 million in those 2 years together. And what happened is that this became the consumer item for the person on your list who already has everything, right? The gift that you give because you can't think of what else to give. It became a Mother's Day gift, a Father's Day gift, a Thanksgiving gift. Give the gift of self-discovery, and often kind of pitched as something that will give you access to the past, but with a certain amount of psychological and emotional remove, right? I'm going to see if I have that Native American ancestry that my grandmother always talked about. I'm going to see if, you know, there's anything interesting. I'm going to find out. I never knew what my grandfather was. Maybe this will tell me. But what I found in my research is that this is often a much more profound engagement. We spend $99 or $69 if it's on sale, and we think this is just something we're doing on a lark. And in fact, we get something that is sort of like a rocket ship to the past. And it's something to tangle with. It's something to think about. It's something to kind of spark our desires to start looking. And in many cases, for a significant minority of people, it's something to kind of disorient them or make them realize that all is not what it seemed. And those stories were so interesting to me.
Yeah, it struck me that multiple people would say they felt like unmoored or
Yes.
lost when they found out this unexpected history. And then that actually leads right into the next question about the sociological and psychological shifts attributed to home DNA testing. And I know that even in the past 5 to 10 years, it's increased the availability, and obviously 35 million people in the database. So it's becoming more and more common. Um, so would you say that this shift is a cultural clash between past and present? And then how does that relate to privacy and transparency?
Yeah. So, I mean, in many ways, what you have is a kind of a collision of two cultures, right? Like you're saying, the culture of the present and the culture of the past, and decisions that were made in the past to, for instance, not tell a child that they were donor conceived, for instance, were rooted in certain stigmas that are less stigmatized now. And so, and you see that with other things. You see that with children who weren't told who their genetic fathers were, in some cases with adoptions. There's a great deal of stigma around, for instance, maybe a unwed teenage mother that nowadays would be much less. And yet the decision to kind of make a secret and keep it over the years somehow doesn't change with the times. I found that the secret kind of gets stuck in amber, right? It travels through time unchanged, even as around us our mores are changing. So now we're in this kind of culture of like, transparency, tell your own story. I'm going to write a memoir about my experience. I'm going to blog about it. I'm telling everyone, like, I'm speaking my truth. I'm doing a documentary. As I talk to people about their experiences, there's so many people who want to tell their stories, which I don't think would have been the case decades ago. And you have a kind of this culture of transparency and authenticity and speaking your truth kind of butting heads against this culture of the past. You often have people from older generations whose decisions to keep a secret may have been rooted in embarrassment and guilt and shame. And those are things that are really hard to kind of change, right? And so you have people who are 60 years old and were never told, right? And at some point it becomes so hard to kind of tell your child, it becomes easier not to, or you've made that decision and you've compartmentalized it and you've kind of forgotten about it and you just let sleeping dogs lie. And suddenly we're in this era when all of that cannot be allowed to lie anymore, because increasingly people are finding out. They're finding out because they test. They're finding out because they never test, but someone related to them tests, and it tumbles out from there. And so we're all kind of drawn into this story of this technology. So yeah, I do think it's in very many ways like a culture clash, and it is often as well a question of rights colliding, right? My right to my own truth about my genetic identity and your right to privacy, right? So if you're a mom who had a child years ago and does not wish to reveal the circumstances, and yet I very much want to know, all of a sudden, whose right should prevail? That was kind of what I wanted to look at. I wanted to understand kind of the 360 of these situations, right? Who gets to decide that this truth is revealed? And there's a somewhat of a triad, I guess I would say. So there's, in the situation of, for instance, a non-paternity event, there's the person who's finding out. There's, say, their mom and that relationship, and sometimes there can be a great breach of trust because if a person's finding out through a test, they're angry that they weren't told. And then the other aspect of the triad is like now this genetic dad or this genetic family on the paternal side. And they are also often, not always, and you hear beautiful stories of reunion, but there is often a closed offness. So there's this question of whose rights prevail, right? Is it my right to know who I am? Okay, but your right to privacy and your right to maybe not even want to know or not want to be contacted. And once I've contacted you, then there's friction. And I just think it's important that we talk about these situations because I think it's happening more and more, right? Obviously, like the databases get bigger, more families experience this. And to the extent that we can normalize the experience, drop drop the shame when it's possible. Talk about them. If there's mental health support, that's like a really important factor. And kind of validate this triad of the experience. I just think that families are going to do better in coming together, which you do see. And when those stories work out, they're really, really beautiful.
I do have another question kind of related to this and privacy and anonymity with donors, donor fathers. And I know there were a couple of stories in there, and you kind of touched on this earlier, how you can find out you have 50 siblings. But when a lot of these donors donated, they were given assurance that this would remain private. But now, obviously, DNA testing is upending that. And could you just talk a little bit more about how that is being experienced by people?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fertility industry, the donors, the parents who used donors, nobody anticipated a world of DNA testing. And so, I write in my book about a man named Robert who tested it in the 1970s. He is somebody who is married. He raised two daughters. He did this sort of just to make ends meet because he liked the idea of helping someone else's family. And I guess I could say that he didn't really think about it, right? It was someone else's family. He was thinking of it in those terms, not his own genetic material. And then the DNA testing age comes up, and his daughters, the two girls that he raised, gave him a DNA test kit for the holidays. It was just a gift, and he did not know what it entailed. So you hear stories like this too, right? The person who would be perhaps most invested in knowing doesn't know, because we've seen the ads for the ethnicity estimate pie chart, and we're getting the gift, the kit as a gift, and we're not looking into it further. So he didn't know that along with the ethnicity estimate comes this list of genetic relatives. So he tests, he sends it in, and guess what? He has donor conceived children who are in the database, and he shows up as their parent, right? And then he's got a kind of a quandary of how does he respond to their writing him a letter. And I tell this story from the point of view of both Robert and one of his donor children, who has become a real helper and in some ways, voice of kind of guidance and support for other donor conceived children. And one of the things she talked to me at length about was how much thought she has given to how you write a letter to your genetic father. This is a topic that I found fascinating and really wanted to dig into, because it says so much about the human heart. It says so much about the conventions of politeness versus the conventions of family. How do you even address this person, right? What tone do you take? And this woman, Stephanie, was talking to me about how much thought she's given to the tone and what advice she gives to others. And I go in length about like sort of all the wisdom she has to offer about exactly what you say in this letter. And there's many, many people right now who are writing letters to their genetic fathers, right? That's like a whole topic that's sort of, worthy of Talmudic discussion. So she reaches out, and as they kind of get to know each other, and there are multiple donor children, what Robert does is decides to basically cede the decision to his daughters that he raised with his wife, because he says, this is really the next generation's decision about how much contact they want to have with their siblings, right? I'm going to be gone before you. I want to kind of honor your preferences. Do you want to know these donor conceived siblings or not? And I will do what you are comfortable with, which makes a lot of emotional sense. And they say, yeah, we're okay with knowing them. And so this begins this delicate dance of getting to know each other, where it's there's somewhat arm's length in the beginning. There's a lot of kind of like care and boundaries. And then over time, there's, falling in each other's arms and crying, right? And there's that both, it's like strangers, but also not strangers, which is such an interesting dance. And what Stephanie told me, this is the donor conceived, his donor conceived children, and there are Robert has 24 children. So 20, his 2 daughters, and then 22 donor conceived. And one of the things she wanted to talk to me about was just the language that she uses and how much thought she's given, what terms she wanted to use with her genetic father, what terms she wanted to use with her siblings, what terms she found offensive, what terms she found off-putting, what she found she could embrace. And what you see is really that we have a deficit of language for these relationships, right? If there are families out there, sprawling genetic networks of between 100 and 200 half siblings from one donor father. And that's because there's no restrictions on the number of children that one donor can conceive. So what language do you even bring to bear for those relationships? What relationships do you want to have? How do you go about forging relationships with people who are all over the country, right? And that's a kind of a fascinating thing that we're just at the beginning of. So I don't know if I answered your question with my long rambling story about Robert, but I think, yes, I mean, I think he was promised anonymity, and we live in an era where this is simply not possible, right? A technology has been invented that voids all those promises, and that's just where we are.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really fascinating tension there. And then also, I think you touched a little earlier on the psychological impact, and I was wondering if you could talk about support groups or like resources available for people who are finding out this information. And like you said, there's really nothing in place in our society to deal with this. And there's so many people testing, so many new revelations happening all the time.
Yeah, I mean, we're always sort of like catching up to technology in many ways. So when I first started researching the book, there was like very little in terms of awareness. There was a wonderful genetic counselor who was specializing in these things, and I would talk to her. And there were, by the end of my reporting of the book, a handful of psychologists who were emerging because they had experienced this themselves. They had discovered they were the products of NP event, non-paternity events, or not parent expected. And they now had insight and they wanted to help other people. But for the most part, what I was seeing was that people were turning to Facebook for support. So totally grassroots situations. There are these groups on Facebook, and there's groups for every experience that you could possibly have and every kind of genealogy research that you want to augment through your DNA. And you would see these discussions of, what do I do now, right? I reached out to my half sibling and she says, I don't want to know you, or I don't believe this, or how could you do this? Or she's invited me in and like, what should I bring and what do I do? And I can't stop shaking. And you just see people advising each other. There are search angels, and those are volunteers who are often women who have often unraveled their own genetic family mysteries and now have the skills and want to help other people. And search angels and genetic genealogists often will have ethical codes that they've kind of built up over time to hold their client's hand, for lack of a better word. They're not really clients because they're usually not paying, but to hold the hand of the person that they're helping, to maybe offer guidance in terms of how to respond to a surprise. They're often in the position of cautioning people to like wait and not make any hasty decisions. Maybe don't reach out right away. But that's basically kind of it. And since in the last maybe year and a half, I've seen a little more movement. So you're starting to see the major companies, which these companies very much are aware that people are getting unexpected results. They put kind of warnings when you test, but people don't pay attention to them so much because they don't assume that they'll apply to them, because why would you? Why would you think that everything you've ever known about yourself is wrong, right? That's just like a crazy idea. It's like, it's too wacky to consider until you actually see the results. And even then, often people are in denial. So the major companies will have elevated customer service lines for the sensitive inquiries, for the person who calls up and says, hey, your results are telling me that I have a half sister, but I know I don't have a half sister. So you must have mixed up, my vial with someone else. And almost always it's not a mixed up vial. It is the person who doesn't know, right, about themselves and about their family, rather than the company being wrong. So you've seen just in the last, say, year or so, the companies have started putting up pages to help you navigate unexpected relationships, suggesting that people may want to have fall back on mental health support. And I'm starting to see even more kind of therapists and psychological professionals emerge, and increasing interest in building networks of psychologists across the country, so that people can, if they've had an experience in Maine or they had an experience in California, they can look up and see like who is available to help me in my state with this experience, which is often a very, very traumatic one.
Yeah, definitely. I can't imagine. I haven't done a DNA test. My sister did, but after reading this book, I'm ready to go out and just dive into the whole thing. I was also struck throughout reading, at one point you said you thought that you were going to be behind the times when you published this book because things were changing so rapidly. And then you were like, wait, I live in a bubble because I'm researching this.
Right. Yeah. I had that experience through the book. I mean, there was this sense of like great urgency to get the book out. Right. And part of that was my publisher's deadline. And part of that was just the sense of like, everything's changing all around me as I'm writing the book. It was a really weird experience of like laying the track for the train, like as the train is running, and I'm also conducting the train. It's just insane because this world changes so rapidly, and there were so many advances in terms of yes, the technology and these ethnicity updates, where the companies are constantly, tweaking their algorithms to give you more accurate ethnicity results, but also changes in the world of how this is being used for law enforcement, and changes in the way we understand privacy as a result, and just like the database is exploding. So yes, I began to worry that, somehow this would be over by the time the book came out. But of course, it's not over. And there are so many people who've, are unaware, who probably will test in the next 10 years and will have this experience, or will choose not to test, but somebody else in their family tests. And I think that's an important point to make, is that we've basically achieved like a tipping point. So we have 35 million people in the database. The vast majority of them are American. So we're close to, if those numbers are anywhere near accurate, we're close to 80% of the database being American is an estimate. So, but if it's around that, we're close to 9% of the US population in the databases. So what does that mean? It means that even if you've never tested, you definitely have cousins, many, many genetic cousins already in there. And that means that potentially if there's a genetic secret in your family, it's going to come out, and it's going to come out whether or not you test. So I'll give you just an example of that. So let's say my brother, I have a brother who in high school conceived a child at the age of 17 and didn't know it. And he's gone through his life the last 30 years, never even realizing that his girlfriend was pregnant. And now that child is 30 years old and grown up and wants to find her genetic father. If she spits into a vial and sends it into a database at, say, Ancestry, it doesn't matter that my brother's not in there. It's enough that I tested. And then she's going to see that I'm her, genetic aunt, and she's either going to reach out to me, or she doesn't even need to. She can just look me up, and she can see enough about me publicly available on Facebook and elsewhere to figure out who my brother is. And if I have multiple brothers, she knows it's one of them. And then she can write a letter and she can reach out, which could be an absolutely wonderful thing for my brother. And it could be a very awkward thing for my brother. And it could be something that he's excited about and his wife is not. You see all sorts of permutations of how people feel about this, right? So let's say I'm not the sister of this guy who conceived a child in high school. Let's say I'm his first cousin or his second cousin or his third cousin. Okay. Let's say I'm his third cousin and we don't even know each other. We're strangers to each other. We don't know each other's names. My testing could be the means through which he is discovered, even though he's not in the database. So think about all the potential third cousins you have whose names you don't know, right? And their decisions to test make it possible for someone who is has some is dogged enough and willing to do the genealogical research to figure out how the branches intersect and at least put some pieces together and potentially find their genetic father. And so what that means is that this is the moment to kind of talk about those things we never talked about, right? Rather than waiting for the databases to reveal them to the person. Maybe you have not told your daughter she was donor conceived. You're not concerned she's going to test, but one of her kids, when they turn 18, might test. You simply don't know. And so, it's the sort of time, I guess, to think about the possibility that these things are going to be revealed. And in my conversations with people, over and over, what I heard is that it's very painful to find out something from a computer screen, that people would much rather hear it from somebody who loves them, even if it's very, very late. It's better late than finding out by DNA test. And that's why I think, we're sort of in a moment when we need to be kind of reconsidering the culture of the past and urging people to have, or at least consider having, some difficult conversations.
Yeah, definitely. With that, it looks like my next question will be perfect. So when you talk to people, if you were going to talk to someone and they were like, what's your best advice for taking a DNA test? I know I just said I'm ready to take one, but obviously there's a lot to consider with all the factors going into this. So what would you recommend for people who want to take a DNA test?
Right. So I could answer that a few different ways, right? The question is like to take it or not to take it. I don't discourage people from doing it. I've done it myself. I'm in 3 databases and I found, that it was really kind of wonderful for our family, the things that we were able to discover. And I can talk about that. But, I feel like there's this kind of sudden immediacy of the past that is revealed. And it just, I don't know, the past doesn't seem so far away. And suddenly you have the means by which you can find out so much information. And it's just kind of like a gift in many ways, right? So I don't see DNA testing as something, that everyone should avoid at all costs. But I also encounter people who say, like, I have privacy concerns, and I don't try to talk them out of it because those concerns are valid and the privacy concerns are manifold. So, probably one of the bigger privacy concerns is sort of like just on the family level, right? Like, I don't want to find out if there's any skeletons in my family's closet. I don't want to be responsible. I don't want to be the reason that, grandma's mad at me. Okay, like that's fair. Keeping in mind that it's probably going to come out anyway at some point, but maybe that's 5 or 10 years down the line and you don't want to be on the hook for it. That's fine. And then I think there's other privacy concerns that are more abstract, but certainly just as valid. And they have to do with this idea that, ultimately it's hard to predict what happens to that information when you kind of give it away. I've read the privacy and consent policies of the major companies, which are lengthy, in some cases 10,000 words for a single company's, sort of policy, and filled with legal language and kind of confusing and hard to follow. But I've read them for the purposes of the book. Of course, I didn't read them when I tested, because who would, right? Nobody does. But I feel reasonably okay about, the protections they've put in place. I feel like, at the very least, to kind of, protect their relationship with their customers, they're not willy-nilly going out and like taking my information and giving it away. Okay. But who knows what happens in the future, right? I mean, my information is not governed by HIPAA, which is, where your medical information, when you go to your doctor and you sign that form and it talks about what can, all the things that they're not going to reveal and release, right? That's your medical privacy. Like this information is mostly unregulated. The federal government and the states have a kind of a patchwork of regulatory things that are brought to bear, but for the most part, it's the companies making the policies. So maybe you're comfortable with the company that you tested with, but at some point down the line, that company gets purchased by another company with a different policy and a different approach about what they're going to do with your information. What rights would you have? I simply can't predict. I simply can't say what would be the case 30 years down the line. And it's also hard to say, there's always this fear of like the information getting hacked, there being some sort of a security breach. And there's open questions about, well, how much would they really be able to find out from that data anyway if this were breached, right? Probably your credit card information would be more useful to somebody. But nevertheless, that's a valid concern. And then there's this question of like, insurance discrimination or genetic discrimination, which is governed by, there's some protections in the federal law, but there are loopholes. And not many states have covered all the loopholes. So, for instance, is there a possibility that you could test and somehow you're then applying for disability insurance and your insurance company finds out that you tested and these were your results that put you at high risk of a particular thing, and then they choose to deny you. Could that happen in the future? So what I say is, I think it's no longer a situation. There's Cece Moore, who's a prominent genetic genealogist, says like she used to be in a position where she would go to genealogy conferences and people would say, how do I convince my great aunt Myrna to test? I know her saliva holds the key to our colonial line, if only, and she refuses. And she says, she used to try to give advice, and now she doesn't, because maybe there's a reason great aunt Myrna doesn't want to test, right? And if great aunt Myrna is kind of strong-armed into testing and finds out something that she would rather not know, Cece Moore says like, no, that's not going to go well for our industry. It's both an ethical quandary and it's kind of like a reputational hazard for genetic genealogy. So that's my extremely long-winded advice to whether you test. And in terms of, there's a kind of a second question embedded in yours, I think, which is where do you test, right? And because I'm a journalist, I'm not in a position to kind of say one company is better than the other, and different people have different opinions. And also, I should say, I'm not a genetic genealogist and not an expert. So I can say my experiences, but I can't say like broadly how they apply to others. But I will say that, and generally speaking, the bigger databases are likelier to yield more genetic relatives for you if that's what you're looking for. As for those ethnicity pie charts, those are totally going to vary from company to company, because while the relative findings are very robust, and if someone's says something that's related to you with a handful of exceptions for particular discrete communities, that person is as closely related to you as they say. But the ethnicity estimates are variable for a variety of reasons, and you have to take them with a grain of salt. They're pretty good, but they're not perfect.
Mm-hmm. One last thing about the privacy, and something that I think some viewers will be interested in, was how the genealogy databases were used to solve the Golden State Killer case, and what kind of implications that raises for privacy of people in the databases already.
Yeah, that's a great question. The Golden State Killer case, which led to the arrest of then the suspect, now he's been convicted, that was spring of 2018. And at the time, there was a significant outcry because what had happened was that information that had been gathered for genealogical purposes was being used for law enforcement. And so there was a sense of kind of violation and, that this was not the original purpose of why people had tested. I'll back up and give a little bit of context. So the way that this crime was solved was actually using techniques that had been pioneered by adopted persons and search angels on behalf of adopted persons since 2011 or so. So it's always been possible to kind of understand, for instance, who your birth mom is, even if she's not in the database, if you were willing to do a great deal of research, especially as the databases got bigger. But no one had used it for law enforcement and to catch a criminal, in this very different context until 2018. So the techniques were not new, but the application was. And the woman who helped was a woman named Barbara Ray Venter. She was a genetic genealogist who helped the police. And she had been using these techniques to help adopted persons for years. So it's kind of an interesting backstory. The way that this information was found out was not through one of the major databases like Ancestry or 23, but through a site called GEDmatch. And GEDmatch is a kind of a third-party site. They don't actually test, but what happens is that people download their information from a place like Ancestry and upload it to GEDmatch. And they do that because they might want to compare across platforms. So the platforms don't talk to each other. If I test in 23andMe, you test in Ancestry, even if we're sisters, we can't see each other. But if we wanted to compare, we could upload to GEDmatch and kind of make the two kinds of our two tests talk to each other. And there's also other tools that genetic genealogists like to use. So what happened is that GEDmatch eventually put in place a policy to make sure that people knew that their DNA was going to be used that way. And Family Tree DNA, which is the other major database that's working with law enforcement, also has similar policy. So now the concern is less so that this idea that your information is going to be used without your consent in this way. But it is still a concern from privacy advocates who say, basically what this winds up being is a kind of a fishing expedition, that people who are, drawn into being identified by police as suspects because of their DNA are people who would never otherwise be pulled in. And so it's kind of like a violation of the Fourth Amendment, the spirit of the Fourth Amendment. And the law enforcement response is, yeah, exactly. We would never otherwise know. These people were not suspects, right? And so, it's been used in many cases since the Golden State Killer. I think Barbara Ray Venter says over 200. It has been used for convictions, but it has not been kind of subjected to, that I've seen, kind of subjected to a defense attorney sort of attacking the premise of it. And I should add that when they find a suspect, they don't then arrest them based on this genetic genealogy kind of research that's being done. They then find like a physical object with the suspect's DNA on it, like a straw or a cup or a tissue that they discarded in a public trash can, and then they compare that to crime scene DNA. So they're not arresting on the basis of this research, they're arresting on the basis of that DNA match. But yes, certainly there are people who are uncomfortable with it. But I think the majority of Americans from the polling I've seen are not up in arms. They think this is a reasonable use if it's being done with the kind of worst case situations, which is murderers and sexual assault cases.
I think Ancestry that had the option to like opt out and then, or they took everyone out and then they could opt back in to be part of the police database or.
Yeah, Ancestry doesn't have a law enforcement access option. So it's just family tree DNA and GEDmatch.
Okay.
So with GEDmatch, you have to opt into your DNA being used that way. With family tree DNA, you have to opt out of, permitting. So basically, you're automatically opted in to permit the law enforcement to, access your DNA or find it if it happens to match the crime scene DNA that they are uploading. Unless you choose to say I don't want that to be viewed.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And then I want to wrap up with one final question. Looks like we're approaching our time limit. And you mentioned that you took a DNA test. So I just wanted to follow up on that and ask you if you found anything surprising in your results.
Yeah. So, I mean, we had like a kind of a wonderful experience, right? And I've tested in 3 different places. I got my first DNA test kit as a present, as so many people do. It was a holiday present from my dad in late 2016. And by that point, or shortly after, most of my family was in the database. And so we were seeing all the same thing. And so I didn't have the experience of discovering my genetic origins weren't what they thought, or that I, was only half related to one of my brothers or something like that, half genetically related. But what we did find was that we had a living cousins in Sweden. Now, my dad it has some Swedish ancestry. His grandmother came over from Sweden at 16 in the late 1800s. And what we found was that we had a genealogist in the family who lived in Sweden, who was all over the databases and had done a ton of research. And when we hooked up with her and reached out to her, she had so much information about our family. And she told us that her mother was alive, and her mother is my dad's second cousin. So, second cousin doesn't sound actually that distant, but you're talking about going back to the 1800s to get there. And so it gave me this kind of weird, jarring whiplash of like, oh, the 1890s, so long ago, no cars. And then, coming over on a boat, right? And then, wait, we have a living second cousin in Sweden. Like, how can that be, right? And as we talked with this genealogist in the family, who was actually her daughter, she had so much information that we just decided we really wanted to meet her. My dad and his sister were very close with their grandmother. So, she helped raise them, and they felt a real connection, and they really were curious to see where they called her nanny, where their nanny came from. So we decided to go, and we went in late 2019. And what was amazing was that we were able to kind of set up a tour of the whole area where Nanny had lived. So we were able to see the school that she went to, the church that she attended, which were right next to each other. And then we were able to drive and see like the foundations of the farmhouse where she lived. And we were even able to see some of the desks that she and her classmates would have sat at. And we were like looking for graffiti to see if her name was on one of them, but it wasn't. But there was like old Swedish graffiti on them. They were like old wooden desks, the connected kind. And then there was a piece of furniture there in storage in one of the buildings that was near the school. And the local genealogist who took us around was able to point to this furniture. There was a lot of furniture there, but he said this piece of furniture was in your relative's family. And so it was a physical object that we could touch, and it kind of blew our minds. And then we got to meet my dad's second cousin, and she didn't speak English and we don't speak Swedish. So her daughter was translating, and it was like mind blowing. And these are people we would not have known about otherwise, because even though there's great records in Sweden and people know a lot about their families, there was kind of like a break in the line. And so we would not have known that they existed. And I think nor they us, but for DNA. And so that felt like an extraordinary gift, and like a reminder that that, the 1890s weren't so long ago, right? And that we can still have access to these kind of familial memories through the power of this technology. And that kind of blew my mind. It was an amazing trip.
Sounds amazing. I can't, like, the physical object, that would just get me.
Yeah, I mean,
Best.
I almost had tears in my eyes. It was amazing.
So wrapping up,
Yeah.
thank you so much for talking to me today. I could continue asking you questions all day. I have a bunch of other ones that I would love to ask, but don't have time. So just a reminder to everybody, the book is in our catalog at aadl.org, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. And I would like to thank Libby again for being here. Thank you so much for talking with me today. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.